The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, good evening, or good night to all our attendees who are joining us from different time zones. Welcome to this webinar on the practical steps to conducting an ISO 27701 gap analysis. My name is Alice Turley, and I will be your host for the duration of this webinar. I am a data privacy, information security and compliance consultant and trainer with IT Governance Europe. My background is compliance, data privacy and consumer protection in the insurance, advertising and education sectors across the last 20 plus years. If you've been on any of my webinars before, you'll definitely recognize this slide. For anyone that is new, IT Governance is a company that has grown very substantially to become a global one-stop continuity, incident management, penetration testing, cyber resilience, IT service management, PCI DSS, and project management. So we're a single entity that you can go to get everything that you might need in order to get yourself ISO 27000 and 27701 compliant with a package of products and services that are appropriate for your organization. We work with organizations of all sizes in all sectors and in all parts of the world. Firstly today, just in case anyone missed my webinar a few weeks ago, I'm going to give a brief overview of the ISO 27701 standard, and I'll look at some of the benefits of having it in place. So for anyone who attended my previous webinar on how to integrate privacy into your ISO 27001 ISMS, this is your chance to grab a quick cup of coffee and bring it back to the desk. Secondly, I'm going to look at the steps involved in conducting a gap analysis. I'm suggesting that there are 6 steps in total, and I'll spend a bit of time discussing each step. Moving on then, I will focus specifically on step 3 of the gap analysis process, focusing in on some of the key questions you should seek answers to when specifically conducting an ISO 27701 gap analysis. Following that, I have a few slides that centre on the mandatory documentation that an organisation must have in place for 27701. And finally then, we'll conclude by looking at the next steps that you can take in order to implement ISO 27701 within your organisation. I will be talking for approximately 45 to 50 minutes, and you will have an opportunity at the end of the webinar to pose questions. As you're aware, everyone is muted during the presentation in order to remove background noise. So if you have any questions you would like to ask during the webinar, please use the questions function in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. You'll see a box marked questions. If you open that up, you can type your questions in here during the webinar itself. And then when we get to the Q&A section at the end, I will read out the questions and share the answers for everybody. And I will get through as many questions as possible in the time we have available. So let's start now by looking at the ISO 27701 standard. Just to note, I will be talking about both standards. So that's the 27001 and the 20701 during this overview. So to save on confusion, I will sometimes refer to the 27001 standard as the ISMS standard and the 27701 standard as the PIMS standard. You will remember ISMS stands for Information Security Management System and PIMS stands for Privacy Information Management System. So while the ISMS standard is widely known, the PIMS standard is a relatively new and thus lesser known standard at the moment. This PIMS standard was developed by an ISO technical committee with input from national standard bodies, external liaison bodies, observers, and also the European Data Protection Board. It is a privacy extension to the ISMS standard, and this is important to note. So an organisation cannot become PIMS certified unless they are either already certified with the ISMS standard or are implementing an ISMS and a PIMS together. The PIMS standard is based on the requirements, control objectives and controls of an ISMS, but it focuses on the privacy-specific requirements. So its requirements concentrate on implementing, maintaining and continually improving a PIMS. Helpfully, the standard itself includes a definition of a PIMS. So as I mentioned earlier, PIMS stands for Privacy Information Management System. It is an information security system which addresses the protection of privacy as potentially affected by the processing of PI. PI is personally identifiable information, so it's very similar to the definition of personal data in the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. It's information that can be used to identify an individual. The main aim of a PIMS is to manage all privacy risks to an acceptable and consistent level, with top management determining the level of risk that is acceptable to the organisation. Data privacy, however, is more than just the GDPR. So this PIMS standard is designed to work across data protection legislation, guidance and codes across the globe. It's designed to cover all privacy obligations. Some organisations may choose to implement the ISMS and PIMS standards in order to benefit from the best practice they contain, while others may decide that they also want to get certified to reassure customers and clients that they are following the recommendations of both standards. Legislation and regulation around the world requires organisations to take measures to ensure the privacy of any personal data that they process. So legislation such as the GDPR, Data Protection Acts, or the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, they're all about protecting the personal data of individuals and protecting an individual's rights in relation to their personal data. However, none of these laws provide supportive guidance on what these measures should actually be in practice. So ISO and the IEC have developed this new PIMS standard to provide this guidance. The GDPR refers frequently to the need for appropriate technical and organisational measures. And while an ISMS can help an organisation to demonstrate considerable compliance with appropriate technical measures, a PIMS will be able to assist an organisation to demonstrate significant compliance with organisational measures. So a company that has both standards successfully implemented will go a long way towards being able to demonstrate their compliance with the GDPR. The PIMS standard itself was published in August 2019, so it's still relatively new. There are some differences in terminology, which you can see here. So the PIMS standard refers to PI as opposed to personal data. What we would consider as processors and controllers under the GDPR are called PI controllers and PI processors under the PIMS standard. And not to be confused with the 6 data protection principles, a data subject is referred to as a PI principal. PI is a recognised term for processing personal data in the US, and remember this PIMS standard is an international standard, so it needs to use terms recognised at an international level. Data privacy, however, as I mentioned earlier, is more than just the GDPR. So this PIMS standard is designed to work across data protection legislation, guidance and codes across the globe. It's designed to cover all privacy obligations. And in considering your privacy obligations, you therefore need to consider what is contained within your privacy universe. Excuse me. For example, you will need to ensure you adhere to your obligations under general legislation such as the GDPR and your local national data privacy legislation. Here in Ireland, we have the Data Protection Act 2018. The UK also has the Data Protection Act 2018, as do many other countries. This is the local data privacy legislation that may have been updated to implement some of the GDPR's derogations or to bring it in line with the GDPR. Other legislation that needs to be considered to see what impact it has on your organisation is the e-privacy regulation, the LED and the CCPA. So the e-privacy regulation is currently at draft stage, but it will replace the current e-privacy directive, and it will complement the GDPR's general rules on personal data processing by providing specific rules governing electronic communications. As such, the e-privacy regulation will take precedence over the GDPR in situations where both laws apply. Note that unlike the GDPR, the e-privacy regulation does not apply to just personal data. It also affects, for instance, business-to-business marketing. The LED is the Law Enforcement Directive. This is a piece of EU legislation parallel to the GDPR, which also has effect from May 2018. As suggested by its name, The LED deals with the processing of personal data by data controllers for law enforcement purposes, which falls outside of the scope of the GDPR. The CCPA is the California Consumer Privacy Act, which gives consumers more control over the personal information that businesses collect about them. This law forces companies to provide more information to consumers about what's being done with their data and gives them more control over the sharing of their data. As well as specialised and general legislation, you may also have privacy obligations imposed on you via contracts or codes of practice, or via standards like ISO 27701, or via other sectorial requirements such as the Consumer Protection Act here in Ireland for the financial services industry. The PIM standard is designed to work across all these obligations within your privacy universe. So you decide to implement the PIM standard in line with your existing ISMS or in tandem with your already existing ISMS implementation. What benefits do you hope to gain from it? Well, firstly, your clients will feel reassured that you have appropriate policies and procedures in place to ensure that their personal information, as well as the personal data of the customers that they may have trusted you with, will be managed safely. Secondly, as the PIM standard addresses the security of personally identifiable information, a 27701 compliant organisation will be able to demonstrate their compliance with respective privacy laws and regulations from around the globe. Recital 81 of the GDPR states, the adherence of the processor to an approved code of conduct or an approved certification mechanism may be used as an element to demonstrate compliance with the obligations of the controller. Thirdly, use of the PIM standard should reduce the complexity of your compliance projects. You will use privacy impact assessments, or PIAs, and the risk management framework in order to highlight and manage privacy risks. Using PIAs in the early stages of the project has significant benefits in highlighting privacy issues at a time when mitigation controls can still be implemented as part of a project plan rather than at the end. By having a PIMS compliant standard in place, you will save time on preparing and conducting privacy audits. A PIMS compliant organisation will have yearly internal audits carried out by an independent, suitably qualified person or personnel, which can be either in-house or external, as well as regular surveillance audits carried out by the certification body. An ISMS and PIMS compliant organisation is a demonstration in itself of the organisation's commitment to information and privacy security, as well as providing assurance for stakeholders and prospective clients. An ISMS and PIMS certified organisation is also able to demonstrate that it has considerable appropriate organisational and technical measures in place to protect the personal data of individuals and meet the rights of data subjects as outlined in the GDPR, as well as in other legislation such as national privacy laws. And remember, ISO certification is internationally recognised. So I've given you a little overview of the PIMS, or 27701 standard, and why it was developed. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at the steps involved in conducting a 27701 gap analysis. I believe there are 6 steps that you need in conducting a gap analysis, and I've outlined them on this slide, but let's consider each one in turn. So step 1, identify the need for a gap analysis. This may sound a little silly, but you don't want to assume you need a gap analysis if you don't. You could be wasting valuable time and resources. So some organisations would use a gap analysis as a continuous improvement tool, looking at ways to improve the business, for example, when employing a new business strategy. Other organisations would complete a gap analysis when new legislation is released, so as to determine what actions they need to take in order to be compliant with the newly issued legislation. Many organisations completed a comprehensive gap analysis during the 2-year timeframe for implementing the GDPR, so as to ensure that they had addressed the most pertinent gaps in advance of the 25th of May 2018 deadline. Many of our clients, when starting on their ISO implementation journey, request a gap analysis to be completed first. so that they know what they have to work on in order to become compliant with the standards requirements. No matter what the reason, it is best to ensure that there is a genuine need to complete such an analysis. In step 2 then, consider all the requirements. So consider the specific area, department, legislation or standard that you want to complete the gap analysis in, and ensure that all applicable requirements are included in your questions. Select people that you will want to interview. Ensure the right people are being included. So for example, if you were completing a gap analysis on the draft e-privacy regulations, then you would need to ensure that people from marketing department are included. In completing a 27,701 gap analysis, you will want to ensure that you talk to representatives from each business unit that processes personal data and plan what questions you are going to ask. Step 3 then is assessing the current state versus the compliant state. So by looking at the current state, you are determining your starting line for improvement. In this step, you are asking questions to determine if there is a gap between the current state and the compliant state. You are interviewing people, looking at documentation and capturing all responses, highlighting areas of non-compliance and noting opportunities for improvement along the way. I'm going to go into a lot more detail on this step over the next few slides, where I look at some of the key questions that should be asked as part of a 27,701 gap analysis. So I will leave this step as is for the moment and move on to step 4. And step 4 refers to understanding the gaps that you have found in your analysis. So putting some order on these gaps, risk rating the actions required, so that you can prioritize actions that need to be taken more immediately than others. For example, if I was completing a 27,701 gap analysis, and as part of that analysis, it was evident that the organisation did not have a privacy policy, I would be recommending that a privacy policy be documented as a high priority. Step 5 then revolves around implementing the recommendations. So all findings or recommendations from a gap analysis should be fed into a recommendation tracker or a similar document. Owners should be assigned and completion due dates agreed. The due dates should be selected based on the level of priority of the recommendation. So, for example, a recommendation with a high priority should be implemented within 1 month. Medium priority actions should not go past, say, 3 months, while low priority could be given 4 to 6 months for completion. Obviously, there will be exceptions, but the completion timelines for these should really be pre-agreed by the senior management team and the reason for the extension documented in the tracker itself. Step 6 then refers to lessons learned, and it's often a step that is forgotten about. Were recommendations implemented? If not, why not? What other actions need to be taken? Recommendations past their due date should be reviewed regularly, with medium and high priority actions discussed by senior management every month or every quarter. If your organisation has an audit committee, then outstanding recommendations should be a standard agenda item for each meeting. So we've looked at the 6-step process, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to focus in now on step 3 and look at some of the key questions that you should ask when conducting an ISO 27701 gap analysis. And the starting question should most definitely be, have the ISO 27001 requirements relating to information security been extended to encompass privacy? This is coming from clause 5.1 of the 27701 standard, where it states a general requirement that information security must be extended to the protection of privacy as potentially affected by the processing of PI. And while it's very easy for somebody to answer yes to this question, you'll be asking a more specific subset of questions to determine if what your interviewee is saying is actually true in practice. Excuse me, and of course, you will be looking for evidence to back it all up. So questions you will be asking are, do the requirements of interested parties include privacy requirements? Interested parties can include customers, data privacy regulators or supervisory authorities, other PI controllers, PI processors and their subcontractors. It is important to note that any interested party can call for independently audited compliance to the ISMS and PIMS standards. So you will be checking the interested party list to see if privacy-related parties are on it, and to see if the requirements include relevant legal and regulatory data privacy requirements, as well as contractual obligations. So, for example, does the organisation's authority contact list include data privacy regulators? Is the GDPR or the local data privacy legislation on the list? My second sub-question asks, has the organisation determined boundaries and applicability of the management system, including privacy? So the boundary and applicability of the management system is defined as per the scope and the statement of applicability. So you'll be asking to see both. The ISMS scope should have been updated or amended to now include the processing of PI. And the statement of applicability should have been updated to include the 27,701 Annex A and Annex B controls, including a justification for inclusion or exclusion. Another key question to ask is, do the objectives account for privacy, and are they aligned with the organisation's strategic direction? So, have the existing ISMS objectives been amended to include objectives that refer to the processing of PI? Or is there a separate set of PIMS objectives in place? Are these objectives in line with the organisation's strategic direction? Some PIMS objectives that you would expect to see would be, for example, a target date for compliance with ISO 27701, or something like 90 to 95% completion rate of data privacy training by all employees within a 2-month period. Please do keep in mind that these questions and those on the next few slides are just some of the key questions that I would ask as part of a 27,701 gap analysis. If I were to actually list all of them, this webinar would go on for a lot longer. This next question is quite a loaded one. So has the organisation established, implemented, maintains and continually improves an information security and privacy management system in accordance with ISO 27001? Firstly, my reference to 27,001 is not a typo here. Remember, 27,701 is the privacy extension to 27,001. You can only achieve certification in 27,701 if you already have 27,001 in place. Ultimately, this question comes from clause 4.4 within the 27,001 standard, which requires an organisation to establish, implement, maintain and continually improve an ISMS. As per clause 5.1 in the 27,701 standard, this requirement now encompasses a PIMS as well as an ISMS. When considering top management's input, you will be looking to see if top management ensures that policy and objectives account for privacy, if they ensure that resources are available and account for privacy, if they communicate the importance of effective information security and privacy management. You'd want to ensure that they ensure the management system achieves its intended outcomes, and that they ensure roles and responsibilities relating to privacy are assigned and communicated. You'd expect that they would assign responsibility for ensuring the management system conforms to the requirements of 27,001 and 27,701, and you would be expecting that they have assigned authority for reporting on the performance of the management system to top management. The policy should account for privacy or have a separate aligned privacy policy. It should include privacy objectives or a framework for setting them. And it should also include a commitment to satisfy privacy requirements and a commitment to continual improvement of the management system. The policy should be documented, communicated within the organisation, and be available to interested parties as appropriate. So in response to this loaded question, you would expect to be provided with evidence in the form of an information security and privacy policy or 2 separate policies, a scope statement, which includes the processing of PI, ISMS and PIMS objectives. You would also expect to view ISMS and PIMS training materials, which should include awareness of incident reporting and the consequences to the PI principle of breaching privacy or security procedures. You should be provided with a statement of applicability that incorporates all of the Annex A 27001 controls, as well as the Annex A and Annex B controls from 27701. You would expect to see a risk register and treatment plans that include the processing of PI, compliance and monitoring plans that cover both the ISMS and the PIMS, minutes of management review meetings which include privacy aspects, and many more. The next key question: does the organization's information security risk assessment identify risks to the confidentiality, integrity and availability of information, including PI, within the scope of the PIMS? So does the organization have a risk management process which addresses both information security and privacy risks? Is that associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity and availability? It is permissible for an organisation to have 2 separate risk assessment processes, providing that both information security and privacy risks are addressed. It is important to note that the organisation, when considering risk, should take into account the risk to the PI principle and not just the risk to the organisation itself. So you would be asking to see the organisation's risk register to evidence that it includes risks relating to the processing of PI and that there are risks to both the PI principles and the organisation itself listed on the register. In assigning a risk assigning a risk rating, you would expect to see that the organisation has taken the CINA, the confidentiality, integrity and availability, into account. So the previous slide considered the risk assessment process. This slide concerns the risk treatment process. So when assessing the applicability of control objectives and controls from ISO 27001 Annex A, does the organisation consider this in the context of both risks to information security and risks to PI, including the risks to PI principles? So has the organisation compared the existing information security controls with the controls listed in Annex A and Annex B of 27001 to verify that no necessary controls have been omitted? Has the organisation a documented statement of applicability that contains all the necessary controls? Does it include justification for control inclusion, justification for excluding any controls, and a statement as to whether or not necessary controls have been implemented? Just going back to the risk register, I would look to see if the organisation has noted appropriate controls to mitigate risks and see if any open risks have been assigned due dates for completion. Have all closed risks been approved, and do all risks have a risk owner assigned? Moving on, another key question is, has the organisation identified its role as a PI controller and/or a PI processor? So it might be timely of me now to provide you with a little reminder of the definitions. So a PI controller determines the purposes and means of the processing of PI. A PI processor acts on behalf of the PI controller, so would process PI on behalf of the PI controller. A joint PI controller is a PI controller that determines the purposes and the means of processing of PI jointly with one or other PI controllers. So under clause 5.2.1 of 27701, an organisation must determine its role as a PI controller, a joint PI controller, and/or a PI processor. And where the organisation acts in both roles, so a PI controller and a PI processor, separate roles must be determined, each of which will have a separate set of controls. Do the organisation's identified external and internal factors take privacy into account? So Has the organisation identified applicable privacy legislation, regulations, judicial decisions, contractual requirements, etc.? These all assist in understanding the context of an organisation. Therefore, you would expect to see that an organisation has completed an assessment of its PI processing activities and determined for which activities it acts as the PI controller and which as the PI processor. For those of you that are familiar with the GDPR and where the GDPR is within scope for your organisation, you will recognise the term lawful basis assessment. And this is very similar to what 27,701 is requiring here. It's about assessing each processing activity, determining its purpose, the lawful basis for that processing, and the reasoning behind the selection of each lawful basis. Over the next two slides, we're going to consider the questions that you should ask in relation to the 27,701 Annex A and Annex B controls. So firstly, we're considering some key questions in relation to the 27,701 Annex A controls, and not to be confused with the 27,001 Annex A controls. The 27,701 Annex A controls are PIM-specific controls, specifically for PI controllers. Obviously, if you were completing a gap analysis, you would be asking questions in relation to each of the 32 controls. However, for today's discussion, I have selected a few of the more fundamental questions to be asked. So, has the organisation identified and documented the purpose and lawful basis for each of its PI processing activities? Do PI principals understand the purpose for processing their PI? How does the organisation reassess the lawful basis for processing when the purposes for the processing change? And how is the organisation obtaining and recording consent from PI principals? The organisation should ensure that PI principals understand the purpose for which their PI is processed. It is the responsibility of the organisation to clearly document and communicate this to PI principals. So request to see the organisation's privacy notice, which is normally available on the organisation's website. The organisation should assess the need for and implement, where appropriate, a privacy impact assessment, or PIA, whenever new processing of PI or changes to existing processing of PI is planned. So PI processing generates risks for PI principals, and these risks should be assessed through a privacy impact assessment. Some jurisdictions define cases for which a privacy impact assessment is mandated. Criteria can include automated decision-making, which produces legal effects on PI principals, where there's large-scale processing of special categories of PI, for example, health-related information, or where there's systematic monitoring of a publicly accessible area on a large scale. These are just some examples. The organisation should have determined the elements that are necessary for the completion of a privacy impact assessment. These can include a list of the types of PI processed, where the PI is stored and where it can be transferred. Data flow diagrams and data maps can also be helpful in this context. So ask to see data flows and data flow maps, ask to see previously completed PIAs and the PIA log itself. Are appropriate contracts with PI processors in place? So the organisation should have a written contract with any PI processor that it uses, and should ensure that their contracts with PI processors address the implementation of the appropriate controls in Annex B. The contract between the organisation and any PI processor processing PI on its behalf should require the PI processor to implement the appropriate controls specified in Annex B, taking account of the information security risk assessment process and the scope of the processing of PI performed by the PI processor. By default, all controls specified in Annex B should be assumed as relevant. If the organisation decides to not require the PI processor to implement a control from Annex B, it should justify its exclusion. So request to see the organisation's contracts with specific PI processors and assess the contracts against each of the Annex B requirements. What information is being provided to PI principals? So the organisation should provide PI principals with clear and easily accessible information, identifying the PI controller and describing the processing of their PI. This information should be provided to PI principals in a timely, concise, complete, transparent, intelligible manner using plain language as appropriate to the target audience. Where appropriate, the information should be given at the time of PI collection. It should also be permanently accessible. So most organisations use the data privacy notice to fulfil this requirement. Again, you should find this on an organisation's website. Is there a retention policy in place? So the organisation should not retain PI for longer than is necessary for the purposes for which the PI is processed. The organisation should have developed and maintained retention schedules for information it retains, taking into account the requirement to retain PI for no longer than is necessary. Such schedules should take into account legal, regulatory and business requirements. So ask to see the retention schedule and disposal policies, and more importantly, assess the organisation's adherence to both. Frequently, I have found that organisations complete the arduous task of putting a data retention schedule in place only to never assess their compliance against it. And this really should be assessed on a regular basis, but at least yearly. And how is data being disclosed? So the organisation should subject PI transmitted over a data transmission network to appropriate controls designed to ensure that the data reaches its intended destination. Specific controls in relation to the transmission of PI to third parties, including to third parties in other jurisdictions, are included in Annex A of 27,701. So for example, disclosures to third parties should be recorded, including what PI has been disclosed, to whom and at what time. So as part of your gap analysis, you would request to see the disclosure of records. To see the disclosures records. The last set of questions that I'm going to talk about today focus on the PI processor. So there are 18 controls listed in Annex B of 27,701, which focus on the PI processor. And not all may be applicable for an organisation, but for any that are deemed not applicable, you would expect to see the justification for excluding them documented in the organisation's statement of applicability. Similar to the last slide, for today's discussion, I have selected a few of the more essential questions to be asked. Does the processor ensure, where relevant, that the contract to process PI addresses the processor's role in providing assistance with the customer's obligations? So you would request to see a sample of existing contracts and assess them to see if they include clauses that demonstrate privacy by design and by default, and that they demonstrate security of processing. There should be clauses that provide detail in relation to notification of breaches, and assurance as well of assistance by the PI processor with any audits or supervisory authority consultations that the PI controller may have. Annex B refers to PI processor's obligations to the customer, but it is important to note that the PI processor's customer is the PI controller. So does the processor provide the customer with the means to comply with its obligations related to PI principles? So how is the PI processor assisting the PI controller in facilitating their PI principal rights? Is there a clause within the contract confirming that the PI processor will facilitate a PI principal's right to erasure or a right to request access to their personal data, etc.? Does the processor provide the ability to return, transfer and/or dispose of PI in a secure manner? So you will regularly see a clause in a contract stating that upon termination of this agreement, all customer data will be disposed of securely or returned to the controller, or similar such wording. In reality, I have asked to see contracts with customers where the contract has been concluded, and I have verified that such a clause is contained within it, And then I've asked to see the evidence of destruction of the data or the evidence of return of the data. And invariably, it emerges that nobody has actually followed up on this clause and that the data is still with the PI processor. You would also ask questions around how are disclosures and subcontracting being handled. So are disclosures being recorded? You would expect to see these records. In addition, if the PI processor is using a subcontractor, you would expect to see evidence of how they informed the PI controller. Was there written authorization? Are there contracts in place between the PI processor and the subcontractor? And do these contracts address the appropriate Annex B controls? So I've now addressed some of the most important questions that you would ask as part of an ISO 27701 gap analysis. And during the last few slides, I've mentioned some of the mandatory documentation that is required. However, I have listed the documents that are obligatory over the next 3 slides. So let's very quickly have a look at them now. Okay, so firstly, the scope statement. There should be a documented scope statement, which includes the processing of PI. Secondly, there should be an information security policy, which accounts for privacy, or a separate aligned privacy policy. The policy should include privacy objectives or a framework for setting them, as well as a commitment to satisfy privacy requirements and a commitment to continual improvement of the management system. The policy should be communicated within the organisation and available to interested parties as appropriate or when requested. Thirdly, any information required to be documented under ISO 27001 is required to be documented under 27701. So for example, an organisation is required to retain documented information about the information security risk assessment and risk treatment processes. These processes should be updated to reference the processing of PI and remain documented. The organisation is required to retain documented information as evidence of the results of management reviews. So the minutes from management review meetings should be documented. And I've mentioned this one on previous slides. There is a requirement to produce a statement of applicability that contains all necessary controls, includes a justification for their inclusion, states whether the necessary controls are implemented or not, and includes the justification for excluding any of the controls in Annex A or Annex B of 27701 and Annex A of 27001. On this slide, I've listed the required documentation or the required documented information under Annex A of 27701. And a reminder, this Annex A focuses on the obligations of PI controllers. I don't propose to go through each of these during today's session, but you will notice that I've mentioned some of them during previous slides. So for example, the control in Annex A 0.7.2.2 states that the organisation shall determine, document and comply with the relevant lawful basis for the processing of PI for the identified purposes. In relation to consent, controls of Annex A 0.7.2.3 and A 0.7.2.4 state that the organisation shall determine and document a process by which it can demonstrate if, when and how consent for the processing of PI was obtained from PI principals, and the organisation shall obtain and record consent from PI principals according to the documented processes. A further example, Annex A 0.7.3.9 states that the organisation shall define and document policies and procedures for handling and responding to legitimate requests from PI principals. And another one, Annex A 0.7.5.2, requires a PI controller to specify and document the countries and international organisations to which PI can possibly be transferred. When it comes then to the Annex B PI processor obligations, documented evidence is required in relation to each of these areas. So for example, Annex B Control 8.2.6 says that the organisation must determine and maintain the necessary records in support of demonstrating compliance with its obligations for the processing of PI carried out on behalf of the customer. Annex B 8.4.2 states that the organisation must provide the ability to return, transfer and dispose of PI in a secure manner. It must also make its policy available to the customer. And remember, customer is the PI controller. Annex B 8.5.2 states that the organisation must specify and document the countries and international organisations to which PI can possibly be transferred. And Annex B 8.5.3 says that the organisation must record disclosures of PI to third parties, including what PI has been disclosed, to whom and when. So we have looked at what the PIM standard is and its benefits to an organisation. We've considered the steps involved in conducting an ISO 27701 gap analysis, and we focused in on the key questions that should be asked. I also discussed some of the mandatory documentation for ISO 27701. So what is next? Well, IT governance can help you in implementing, auditing, analysing and monitoring your compliance with ISO 27701. We can provide templates for all the necessary documents. We can provide a gap analysis tool and starter bundle kits. We provide specific certified training courses, the ISO 27701 PIMS Lead Implementer course and the 27701 PIMS Lead Auditor course. Both have exams at the end. Both are certified to ISO 17024, and completion of each course provides you with 14 CPD points. In addition, we can provide you with consultancy-led support in order to carry out your gap analysis, your internal audits, or to assist you with implementing 27701 within your organisation. You can contact us via any of the mediums shown here for any questions or queries you may have after the webinar has concluded. And this actually brings us to the end of the prepared portion of today's webinar. So now we'll look at some of the questions received so far. Just a wee reminder, if you do have any questions and you haven't documented them yet, please use the questions function in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. You will see a box marked questions, and if you open that box, you can type your questions in here. I'll read the questions out and then answer them, and I'll aim to get through as many as possible before our time is up. And I suppose I should state as well, even before I start on the questions, some people ask, will these slides be available? So yes, the slides will be available. They'll be sent out to everybody who registered for this webinar a few days after the webinar itself. Alternatively, I believe the slides are in the download section of this webinar, so you should be able to access them from here immediately. Okay, so questions then. When talking about steps in conducting a gap analysis, you gave an example of documenting a privacy policy as high priority. Can you give an example of something that you would consider low priority? So that's a good question. Frequently we think of all action items relating to privacy to be high priority, but that's not always the case. So an example of low priority. Let me see, I completed a GDPR gap analysis for a client recently, and I found that the employee handbook referred to older data privacy law. It had not been updated to refer to the GDPR nor to the Data Protection Act 2018. All staff interviewed were well aware of the GDPR and the DPA 2018, and they'd all received specific training on both, the results of which were evidenced. It's just that the employee handbook itself needed to be updated. So I would deem that action of updating the employee handbook to be a low priority. Do all the controls listed in Annex A and Annex B need to be included in the statement of applicability? So it's another good question. Yes, all the controls listed in the annexes do need to be included in the statement of applicability. However, where control is not deemed necessary by risk assessment, or where it is not required by legislation or regulation, then you can justify its exclusion in the statement of applicability. Would you include having a minimum number of data breaches as a PIMS objective? So I think you mean something like having a target of, say, only 3 data breaches per quarter. While I understand that ideally an organisation wants to minimise the number of data breaches, I don't agree with setting targets like this, as really it's only creating an incentive for staff not to flag when they have had or when they have caused a data breach. And it's more important that staff highlight data breaches or potential data breaches so that the organisation can take proactive steps to minimise the effect of the breach on the PI principles. As well as to ensure that they're reporting the breach to their supervisory authority within the correct timelines. For example, GDPR has a timeline for controllers to report all data breaches to them within 72 hours, and that's not working hours. Let me see. When would an organisation act in both the roles of PI controller and PI processor? Can you provide an example? So every organisation is the PI controller for their employee data. So if you take a company like AWS, a company, a cloud hosting facility, they would be acting in the role of PI processors for their clients, but they would be acting in the role of PI controller for their own employees' data. Can I obtain certification to both 27001 and 27701 at the same time? So no is the answer to that. 27701 is the privacy extension to 27001. You must be certified to 27001 first and can then apply for 27701. So you can still implement both standards within your organization at the same time, but your ISMS must be audited and certified before the PIMS can be audited. Okay, could ISO 27701 be included in scope of ISO 27001 certification officially, or is it only for self-assessment? Okay, so yes, you could include the scope for 27701 within your 27001 certification. However, I suppose this kind of ties in with the question that I've just answered as well. Officially, you would only be audited and certified against 27001 first. However, by having it included within your scope, it would leave you in a very good position then to be audited against 27701 shortly after your 27001 certification. Does ISO 27701 cover all aspects of GDPR, such as how the right to be forgotten is implemented? Okay, with regards to covering all the aspects of GDPR, as I mentioned earlier, when ISO and IEC were building this standard, they did consult with the European Data Protection Commission, the European Data Protection Board, and as a result, a considerable amount of GDPR has been taken into account within this standard. In fact, one of the annexes, and I'm not sure which one, I can't remember offhand, could be Annex C or Annex D, one of those annexes does have a very detailed table of all the aspects of GDPR that have been included within 27701. Certainly all the key requirements of GDPR have been included within the standard, and the fact that you referenced there the right to be forgotten, certainly all individuals' rights have been incorporated into the 27701 standard. Okay. Sorry, I think I just missed a question. Can you please explain why one should go with ISO 27701 instead of ISO 27018? Okay, again, a very good question. I suppose the fact that 27701 being not just a relatively new standard, but was written with considerable input from the European Data Protection Board. And it does take all the aspects of GDPR, or a lot of the GDPR aspects into account. That certainly, if I was in an organisation considering which standard to go for, and if I had an ISMS already in place, then I would be looking to implement the 27701, as both 27001 and 27701 together, being certified in both, goes a long way towards demonstrating your compliance with both the technical and organisational measures that GDPR require organisations to be compliant with. Oh, and nice comment. Thanks for a good webinar. Thank you very much. And I think that is all the questions. I'm just going to check to make sure that I haven't missed any. No, it looks like all that's certainly all the questions that are documented here. If anybody, I just might give a minute in case anybody is still writing. No, I think that. Oh, and thank you for the compliments. Thank you very much. That actually brings us to the end of today's webinar. I hope you found it useful. You can access, of course, all our range of products and services via the contact details that are on the slides, and also via our website, itgovernance.eu. And lastly, I just want to say thank you very much for attending the webinar.